I'm just going to throw this out there, and it may be a little embarrassing for me to admit in public, but I like to be liked. I can't really point to just one reason for some pretty deep-seated feelings of shame and unworthiness, but I can promise you that they've always been there. And so, naturally, I like to be liked. And what's honestly worse than that is that I crave validation. I will seek out any opportunity in which I know that I can shine and 100% avoid anything at which I know I will fail. I mean, I don't feel like my self-worth can take that kind of hit. And I don't know about you, but why do something you're bad at? I mean, if I think about it, I realize I've missed out on so many places where I could grow or so many opportunities to move forward in my life, but fear of failure has held me back. Brene Brown has this great quote, and she says that you either walk inside your story and own it, or you stand outside your story and hustle for your worthiness. And honestly, I'm pretty good at hustling. And it's not that hard in today's social media culture. I mean, for a long time, I was able to use Instagram to feed my self-worth. I'm really good at what they call the highlight reel. And if you're a part of my generation, you know what I'm talking about. You take 15 of the exact same picture, and then you scroll through them and analyze them, which one's perfect, and you just sort of agonize over which one you should post and what caption would be perfect, and should you hashtag that, or does it make you look like you're trying too hard? Tweak everything about it until it's perfect, and then boom, share it with the whole world. Every single post carefully calculated to make your life appear just so. And every comment made me feel just a little more validated. And every time someone would like my picture, I felt just a little more worthy. And I mean, what's wrong with that really, right? Well, what I'm not telling you while I joke about my posting habits is that for me, Instagram, social media, all those things was always a little bit more than just a way to gain validation. It was a way for me to hide what I was really struggling with. For a long time, my feelings of shame and unworthiness that I was talking about had led me down some pretty dark paths, and I'd spent years dealing with depression. And what I wasn't going to do in any of those times was tell anybody what I was struggling with, because who's going to want to stand in that story with me, right? And so I would just fight on my own and try to crawl my way out of it, and eventually I'd break the surface. But it always came back. Maybe it was weeks, maybe it was months later, but the depression always came back, and I felt so isolated. And every single time I was posting something perfect, I knew that I was hiding something real. This isn't me. This is just a heavily edited version of what I want you to think I am. And there was this little voice inside of me that was always saying, they all think you're a great mom, but if they only knew. Or they think you and your husband have the perfect marriage, but if they only knew. I was drowning in my story, and no one was the wiser because things looked great on the outside. And it took a long time for me to realize that I didn't feel safe in vulnerability with people because I didn't really understand the grace of God. Sure, God had forgiven me all of my shortcomings, and he knew all of my deepest, darkest secrets, but because of that, he loved me just a little bit less, right? And even if he didn't love me just a little bit less, surely I was worth just a little bit less because of all of those things. And if I couldn't trust God, the God of the universe, to love me in spite of my mistakes, how could I trust people to even still like me if they knew my truth? And so with that fear of vulnerability tucked safely away, I kept on going. I kept on standing outside of my story. And I'm sure you can imagine how well that worked for me, right? Because any adult in this room who has lived life at all can tell you that the best way to overcome something is to hide it, right? And clearly, I'm up here to tell you that since the day I chose to hide my truth and bury it in shame, that life has been perfect, right? No, obviously not. Eventually, for me, things fell apart. And last year, I entered into one of the darkest seasons of depression in my life. I was hiding so much about my struggle from my husband. And I had isolated myself from all my friends and family. And even though I'd called out to God in my pain, even though he knew where I was and I had let him see my whole truth, it eventually wasn't enough anymore. Because I realized that the more I hid who I was from the people here on earth, the more I was missing out on any sort of full life that I could have. I had owned my hard truth with God, and I had to do it with people too. And so my shift towards vulnerability slowly began. And it started with the hardest conversation I've ever had to have with my husband, Matt. In my pain, I'd made some really bad decisions. And while details aren't important for you to understand the heartache in our marriage, I can tell you that I had betrayed his trust in me. And we had lost a sense of security in the foundation of our marriage that we would have to fight really hard to get back. And I was sure that going into this conversation, that was the end. This would be the end of us. I mean, that's what happens, right? That's what I've seen my whole life. Screw someone over, they leave. Do something wrong, people are out. Nobody wants to live in that mess with you. And remember, at this point, God loves me just a little bit less, okay? So how can I trust Matt to forgive me or even love me the same ever in spite of what I had to share? I was prepared for that. I was prepared for the leaving part. I was good at that. I knew what that looked like. But I wasn't prepared for God to use Matt's response to me in that conversation to show me the depth of God's grace. In that moment of my ultimate vulnerability, my husband took my hand, and through tears of his own pain and disappointment, he looked right at me and he said, "There is nothing that could convince me to stop loving you. We will get through this together." And a few days later, he sent me this quote, which, ironically enough, he had found on Instagram. And it said, "Tell me every terrible thing you've ever done, and then let me love you anyway." And I mean, in a nutshell for me, guys, that was God's grace that I did not understand. You see, I'd lived my whole life based on the understanding that God's love for me was somehow tied to the quality of my decision making. And so then people and their ability to love me and accept me for who I was somehow a result of my ability to create a perfect life. My favorite translation of Romans 11:6 says, "Since it is through God's kindness, then it is not by their good works. For in that case, God's grace would not be what it really is, free and undeserved." It's not anything that I did or anything that I deserved that made Matt respond to me with such grace. It was God's kindness towards me. And so after Matt, I eventually shared my story with someone else, and then another person, and then another. And every time I waited for them to walk away. And every time they chose to love me anyway. And again, it had nothing to do with what I'd done or what I deserved, but it was God's kindness that allowed them to show me such grace. And what I learned through this whole thing was that God didn't just love me a little bit less because of the mistakes I made. He loved me fully in spite of them. And the cool thing about people being made in God's image is that for the most part, they'll choose to love you too, if you trust them enough to be truly vulnerable. Guys, I hustled for my worth for so long. And when I couldn't do it anymore, I walked inside my story and I owned it. And then I finally understood the depth of God's kindness and grace towards me. And it feels so good. It feels so good living on the surface. So maybe there's something that God is waiting to hear from you. Or maybe there is someone who's earned the right to hear your story. Share it with them. Trust people enough to tell them the worst things you've ever done, and then let them choose to love you and maybe even still like you anyway.